We're going to try and attempt the impossible and break down memory timings one by one. This will be over several content pieces. We're making a big article push on this. The articles will be linked in the description below as always, but we also have a video component here, which will have some key animations we've made for the memory timings. Memory timings are incredibly complex. It's crazy how complex they get. And we spoke with several vendors before taking on this task. As Asus told us, you need to take your time with this one. Pretty easy to screw things up. So as a general introduction, today we're going over primary timings. We're going to provide some animations of how they all work, what they do, rows and column access, and all of that stuff. We'll also be talking about basic formulas to calculate cycles and things like that, and what the numbers mean for each primary timing. At a later date in another content piece, we plan to go over the secondary and the tertiary timings and just drill down further as we go through this content for RAM and memory timings, because they have a huge impact on performance in some instances, and there's not a lot of information out there that's condensed in just one area, so we're going to go for that. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's high-end thermal paste and liquid metal. Thermal Grizzly's Cryonaut is an affordable, high-quality thermal compound that doesn't face some of the aging limitations of other pastes on the market. Cryonaut has a thermal conductivity of 12.5 watts per meter Kelvin, focuses on endurance, is easy to spread, and isn't electrically conductive, making it safe to use on GPU dies. Thermal Grizzly also makes Conductonaut liquid metal, which we've used to drop 20 degrees off some temperatures in our delidded tests. Buy a tube at the link in the description below. First, the basics. While memory frequency is measured in hertz, or cycles per second, the unit for memory timings is just plain cycles. To convert clock cycles to a measurement of time requires knowing the frequency of the memory. This is listed in megahertz, or units of 1 million hertz. 3200 megahertz has a clock frequency of 3.2 billion cycles per second, so the time for a cycle to complete should be 1 over 3.2 billion seconds. However, modern memory is DDR, double data rate, meaning data is transferred on the rising and falling edge of each clock. So advertised frequencies are twice the real clock frequency. That's part of why when you set memory to 3200 megahertz in BIOS, CPU-Z will show 1600 megahertz. The time is really 1 over 3.2 billion over 2 seconds here. If our example memory has a CL timing of 16 clock cycles, this translates to 16 times 1 over 3.2 billion over 2 seconds, or 0.000001 seconds, or 10 nanoseconds if we make it easier. The equation is 1 over advertised frequency over 2 times timing in cycles equals timing in seconds. For a Ddr4 1600 kit, a CL of 9 translates to 11.25 nanoseconds, actually slower than our previous example. Latencies have gradually increased over the years with the physical distance that signals have to travel. The speed of light is the hard limit here, but frequency has increased as well, and therefore performance has still improved. Frequency is very important, but it's just one element of performance, as with CPUs. There are many different timings, but they deal with a small list of commands overall. One of them would be when they can be issued, or how long it takes to execute, how many cycles pass before a response is sent back. So we have a table here of just the Ddr4 commands from Wikipedia, which will give you some basics, so we can throw that up on the screen. The important signals from the top row are ACT, or activate, RAS, or row access strobe, CAS, or column access strobe, these are no longer strobes, it's a side note, and WE, or write enable. RAS and CAS are often referred to simply as column and row address because they are no longer strobes. The terminology is a holdover. These are active low signals, so they can either be high or low, H or L in this column, or 1 or 0. Together, they form a 4-bit code that specifies a command to be executed. The signals have changed a bit over the years, but for the most part, Ddr4 has the same list of commands that SDRAM has always had, and therefore many of the same timings. For some background information on stuff like banks, rows, and columns, there's a venerable 2010 article from AnandTech that's a good overview of what SDRAM specifically is and how it functions if you're curious about that. Let's go through a few of these. Activate opens up a row of a bank. A row must be active for reading and writing data. If a row isn't active, it is idle. And if a row is activated, it stays that way until a pre-charge command. Pre-charge closes the open row in one or all banks by 2 separate commands, putting them into the idle state. Data is still stored in idle banks, but they must be activated again before reading or writing. Read and write are self-explanatory. With these commands, an auto precharge flag can be set to automatically precharge the row when it's done. ZQ calibration compensates for temperature and voltage variation. It can be a recurring command, but not frequently enough to make the related timings important to us. Refresh refreshes the charge in memory cells by writing data back in place without changing it. DRAM is volatile memory, which means that it requires power to store data. Bits are represented by charges on capacitors, which leak over time if they aren't read from or written to. We'll discuss this more in the next piece. Look at the tREFI and tRFC section for that. All banks must be idle or pre-charged before a refresh. The JEDEC, or Joint Electronic Device Engineering Council and Solid State Technology Association, is an organization that publishes standards for DDR4, DDR5, SSDs, mobile memory, ESD, GDDR6, and more. They're responsible for standardizing and defining everything in our article and this video, from abbreviations to the entire concept of DDR4. As part of this, JEDEC publishes tables with baseline timings for different RAM types, several of which are saved in SPD. Memory manufacturers produce strictly JEDEC-defined varieties of RAM, like DDR3 1600 MHz, 11111128, but can make them capable of higher speeds and market them as such. For example, Corsair sells 4600 MHz memory, which, as of this writing, is a higher speed than JEDEC has defined for DDR4. When a newly built system is powered on for the first time, the board will check SPD and default to the best set of these JEDEC-approved slow but safe speeds. XMP is an SPD extension. It's Extreme Memory Profile, something that Intel has largely pushed here, and it's a higher performance spec that's jammed into the leftover space of EEPROM on the memory modules. These are conceptually the same thing as JEDEC profiles, but they're higher performance, and they're optimized by the memory manufacturer itself. That might be someone like GSkill or Corsair or any number of other memory manufacturers. XMP contains settings that memory manufacturers say will probably work, and they might not be supported depending on the quality of the CPU's IMC or the motherboard or SoC and other components. This is a problem with things like that aforementioned Corsair 4600 MHz memory, where although it can achieve 4600 MHz, you're starting to get to a point where you're binning the CPU IMC, the memory, and also you're choosing a very specific motherboard, and also you want a high bin CPU core so that you can get all the overclocks right. So it's kind of getting into territory where there are really no guarantees, and those higher frequency kits can almost be misleading because it's pretty rare that you get the ultra performance. You might get somewhere pretty close unless you've really binned everything in the product line. So XMP again is an SPD extension. For enthusiast RAM, the advertised speeds are usually most easily attained by just simply applying XMP. Some vendors call these different names, which we'll go over momentarily. XMP is technically an Intel standard, but an extreme memory profile is literally just a list of numbers that can be read into the system from EEPROM. So if the board allows it, for example, some vendors like AMD boards might have rebranded XMP as DOCP or EOCP, or some of them just straight call it XMP, even though it's kind of originally was an Intel thing. So XMP is a bit redundant in a lot of cases because we'll call it XMP profile, which it does mean extreme profile, but just remember that nobody cares, including Intel, otherwise they wouldn't have abbreviated extreme with an X. That's what XMP is though, and that's what SPD is. Neither XMP nor SPD contain every single timing, and memory vendors can only do so much tuning. A lot of this falls on motherboard makers. According to a Kingston representative, quote, "We tune the primary timings, CL, RCD, RP, and RAS only. The other timings are left alone at JEDEC's recommendations, likely for the MRC. In regards to some specific subtimings we asked about, quote, since they are not in the SPD or XMP, we can't change them even if we need to. This lines up with our experiences in the real-world impact section of this content. Even if memory manufacturers wanted to go deeper, there's a specific and limited list of SPD entries." So when it comes down to it, RAM doesn't set its own frequency and timings. BIOS does. RAM carries the marketing for what frequency and timings it should be able to hit, and you can apply an XMP profile redundantly in order to achieve those timings and that frequency easily. But the BIOS ultimately dictates how well this works, and that's why some boards just straight won't work with different memory kits, even if they're rather modest in their timing goals. On Intel boards, this element of the BIOS is called the MRC. And the MRC is one area where board manufacturers can secure an advantage in their performance. So this is where motherboards really differentiate themselves. It's not just the VRM or the heatsink or all of the different ports on it. It's what is their support for memory. And with this specific example, the sheer variety of RAM and the differences between Samsung, Micron, and Hynix, the three major memory suppliers who actually make the chips that go on the Corsair GSkill memory, the amount of difference between them is hideously complex to adjust, and people like the ASUS team spend a lot of time perfecting their BIOS to try and get them as good as possible with all these different types of kits, which is just plug and play and a lot of trial and error. So memory and board manufacturers can work together to bake in optimal timings for each kit of memory. And for the most part, these are determined if left auto during post, where they should remain unchanged unless there are boot failures, at which point we start deferring to things like memory training. Memory training can appear kind of like a dark magic of some kind. Basically, with memory training, what you're doing is forcing boot failures until you can finally get into the system. It might be mostly stable. You might have some memory errors with really intense applications, but the idea is that you are hitting a retry button or just literally letting the motherboard cycle. And a lot of the time, if you just leave it alone, the motherboard will eventually cycle into a successful boot for timings, even if it looks like it's failed the first maybe 3 to 5 times. We've had instances with the retry button with high memory overclocks for 3D Mark record testing. We've had instances where just hitting that retry button for 5 minutes will sometimes eventually kick it into a boot. And that's because it's sitting there retrying different timings over and over until it finds one that is stable for the motherboard. And what's actually happening is the IMC will try a variety of different settings in an attempt to stabilize the system. Not all of them are timings, and that's at each boot of the system. It's an important point for even non-overclockers because, again, if the memory seems unstable, just cycle it a few times and see what happens. Maybe it'll work and you'll get lucky. Retry buttons are an excellent tool for making this work. Different kits have different JEDEC standards, so different sub-timings get loaded. This is an issue we've run into before. We had 2 kits identical in frequency and capacity, but with different latencies. However, the 1618-1836 Corsair kit somehow managed to outperform our 1414-1434 GSkill kit in tests. After discussing this with both manufacturers, it turned out that Corsair sticks were dual-sided with groups of 512 megabyte x 8 ICs, while GSkills were single-sided with groups of 1 gigabyte by 8 ICs. 512 by 8 is an older style, so it actually has tighter sub-timings defined by JEDEC. See the What Are Timings section of our article linked below. The biggest culprit in this case was tRFC, or refresh cycle time. We'll cover the full definition of this in part 2, but for now the important thing to know is that the value set by JEDEC for Corsair's type of kit was 416 and it was 560 for GSkills. When we adjusted GSkills down to the same tRFC value that Corsair had, with no further adjustments, the GSkill kit pulled ahead in performance and remained stable, as shown in our Ashes of the Singularity benchmark results that we can put on the screen or have had on the screen. This is an extreme case, but it shows both the value of experimenting with subtimings and the frustrations of benchmarking memory. If the ASUS board happened to have a set of optimized timings specifically for this GSkill kit, it would have performed better than the Corsair kit from the get-go, but the ASUS board just didn't have this specific kit optimized. With all that out of the way, it's time to talk about the primary timings that you see listed everywhere. They're on the product boxes, the sticks of RAM themselves, and they're standardized. So timings will be listed in a set format. It's TCL, tRCD, tRP, and tRAS, with CR sometimes listed as well. Going through the primary timings, first we have CAS latency, TCL or TCAS as it is commonly known. Wikipedia describes this as follows: the number of cycles between sending a column address to the memory and the beginning of the data in response. This is the number of cycles it takes to read the first bit of memory from a DRAM with the correct row already open. Unlike the other numbers, this is not a maximum, but an exact number that must be agreed on between the memory controller and the memory. Our explanation or expansion on this is as follows. CAS latency is the most widely talked about and compared memory timing. The CL timing is an exact number, the base time that it takes to get a response from memory in the best possible scenario described previously is referred to as a page hit. The other primary timings, other than command rate, are minimums. It's important to remember that although we'll be talking about how these timings relate to reading data from memory, that's just one thing that they affect. The next one is RAS to CAS delay, or tRCD in BIOS. Wikipedia states the following: the minimum number of clock cycles required between opening a row of memory and accessing columns within it would be tRCD. The time to read the first bit of memory from a DRAM without an active row is tRCD plus CL. Our version to expand upon this is that RAS to CAS is one potential delay to reads and writes. tRCD is the number of clock cycles it takes to open a row and access a column. If a request for data is made when there are no rows open, referred to as a page miss, it will take at least tRCD plus CL number of clock cycles for the CPU to receive the first bit of data in response. The next one is row precharge time, or tRP. Wikipedia says, quote, the minimum number of clock cycles required between issuing the precharge command and opening the next row. The time to read the first bit of memory from a DRAM with the wrong row open is tRP plus tRCD plus CL. And our version expands in this way: if the wrong row is open, a page miss, it needs to be closed or precharged. Then the next needs to be opened, and then the column within the row needs to be accessed. This, therefore, takes tRP plus tRCD plus CL time to complete. Row active time is our next item, or tRAS. Wikipedia says the minimum number of clock cycles required between a row active command and issuing a precharge command is row active time. This is the time needed to internally refresh the row and overlaps with tRCD. In SDRAM modules, it is simply tRCD plus CL, otherwise approximately equal to tRCD plus 2 times CL. Our expansion on this is that it's also known as active to precharge delay, or minimum RAS active time. The first equation for SDRAM is the relevant one here, but it should be more than that. We've seen multiple different true ways to calculate tRAS, but given the complexity of memory operations, good old trial and error remains the easiest. For example, we somehow booted with memory at 1626, and that doesn't make sense by anyone's rules if you were to check forums online, but it worked. Command rate is the last one. It's known as CR or CMD, CPC, TCPD, all kinds of things. And for AMD, it's defined as the amount of time in cycles between when a DRAM chip is selected and a command is executed. 2T CR, or 2T command rate, can be very beneficial for stability with high memory clocks or for a 4-DIMM configuration. It's also known as the command period. This will either be 1T or 2T on modern memory, with 1T being faster. Despite the unique T notation, this is measured in clock cycles like the other timings. There's generally a very small performance delta between the two options. That's it for the ultra basics. This is an extremely hard topic to boil down. Part of the problem we run into, even just researching this, is that as you find definitions for different aspects of memory, you almost need more definitions just to understand the definitions. So it's very difficult to boil it down. At the end of the day, the primary timings are pretty straightforward and simple in what they do. See the previous animation for an explanation of that. It's just that once you really start getting into things like secondary and tertiary, the trouble is there's a lot of play between the timings, how they interact with each other, how one being higher might mean another one can't be certain values and things like that. And we'll try and boil these down further. So check back for part 2, where we will explore at least the secondary timings, if not tertiary as well. And then we'll define the rest later if we have to. But that should get you started on timings and on memory. It's a really interesting subject that's important. And up until the last year or so has been pretty uninteresting for most people. But because of Ryzen's very peculiar early interactions with memory, with the first launch of Ryzen, it kind of, memory timing started to get some attention. And then you start looking at Intel overclocking. You can push the CPU reasonably to 5 gigahertz in a lot of cases, but get stuck on memory performance. So timings are coming back into interest, I think, for the community, and it's a good time to go through this stuff. As always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly. You can buy this shirt, which is currently on pre-sale. It's a limited run. Once they're gone, they're gone. We're not going to make more. Or pick up one of our mod mats if you want a 4x2 modding service for your next build. And if you want something a bit on the lower end, you go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to join our Discord. Subscribe for more to get part 2. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.